beginning from President Xi's administration, whether China has shifted at all its focus of strategic partnership from US-China to now China-Russia. Many have this question. What is your answer?
Yes, I still remember when I was in the States, right after the Xi came into power, some American very interestingly asked me if the Americans still your first priority, because U.S.-China is the first priority of Chinese diplomacy. It's a long time talk in both the United States and China. I say, why? Because they told me that they have noticed that President Xi's first visit is to Russia. And aftermath, they see a very warm Sino-Russian relations. Putin visited Beijing and Xi visited Russia again, and each year almost 5 to 6 times for those two leaders to meet. So many Americans said, oh, it seems that now China-Russian relations is the first priority. So my answer is no. I think both US and Russia have the same importance to China, but they have totally different means. For example, Russia is important because of its not only a big power, big military, and also it's our biggest labor country. So it's both big power and big labor. That's why it's very important. But the United States is important in many aspects. For example, economically speaking, we have more than 500 billion trade amounts, and elective side to say that American influence all the co-interests of China, like Taiwan, Tibet, South China Sea, all those interests. So in terms of this, and the U.S. also important. So for China, it's how to balance those two very important big power relations, U.S. and China, and Russia and China. And so far, I think we get a very good balance.
Well, we also have now Robert Ross, who is a professor of political science at Boston College and associate at the John King Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies with Harvard University. Professor Ross, welcome to our program. Great to have you. What do you make of your colleague here in Beijing, Yuan Peng's statements that China trying to keep a balance between Moscow and Washington?
Well, Yuan Peng is an old friend, so I'm very pleased to be on this program with him. I think we need to understand the very different relationship and very different impact the United States and Russia have on Chinese security. We need to understand that Russian presence in the Russian Far East on the Chinese border is close to zero. This has particularly been the case in the last 2 or 3 years as the Russians have had to move many of their very best troops out of the Far East over into the Caucasus and Eastern Europe to deal with NATO and problems in the Ukraine and now in Syria. And of course, there's no infrastructure in the Russian Far East. And so for the Chinese, the Russians are not a security problem, but simultaneously, they're not much of an asset or a contribution either, because the Russians really can help the Chinese deal with America in East Asia, because the Russians are preoccupied with their problems in Europe. And so in this regard, the primary consideration for the Chinese should be a combination of two things, I would suggest. One is how to use the rise of Chinese power, the rise of China, to achieve accomplishments in East Asia for Chinese security, while simultaneously maximizing U.S.-China cooperation. This is inherently a very difficult task, one which has been fraught with problems in recent years.
Well, we also have Mr. Barbich coming from Russia. You have been, sir, attentively listening to your other two colleagues coming from Washington and Beijing. So Russia's vision, which chair is more comfortable for Russia to be an ever closer partner with China, even more strategically important for China than Washington? Is that what you're seeking for when it comes to Moscow's vision? Or a very pragmatic partnership that we are talking about here?
Well, I think that Washington and the European Union, they simply left Russia no choice but to seek as close a cooperation with China as possible. The actions of the United States and the European Union in the last 5 years in particular were so irrational that they made Sino-Russian cooperation an inevitability. Let me tell you, for example, that for many years Russia had this project of supplying natural gas to China, and the project did not move very fast because the Chinese offered a pretty low price. So what happened was that right after the conflict with Russia over Ukraine, President Obama went to the West Pacific and reassured all of China's adversaries. You know, he visited Japan, he visited Philippines, and everywhere he spoke about the United States supporting these countries against possible Chinese hegemony. So in the end, the Chinese raised the price, and Mr. Putin had a chance to go to Beijing and sign a pretty good agreement on the supplies of Russian natural gas. And I want to add that Russia wants to have good relations with both East and West. In general, Russia is culturally closer to Europe,
of course,
and even to the United States than to China. But the irrational policies of Mr. Obama and his predecessor simply left Russia no choice.
I see.
If we want to survive in the global environment, we can't survive alone. So if the United States and the EU are so hostile, we will get closer to China.
Oh, Mr. Yuan Peng, in Beijing, is China ever closer to the similar strategic position, or in a way paradox, as Russia is on the one hand want to have very good relations with the West, particularly the US, on the other hand on some strategic significant issues such as South China Sea and many others, there is a sharp difference when it comes to opinions between Washington and Beijing?
I think today is not a Cold War era now.
Not anymore.
Where everyone knows that the triangular relations among China, Soviet, and the United States during the Cold War. So some want to make something similar to today's the triangular Russia, China, the States, to the Cold War type of triangular, but totally different. During the Cold War, I think the nature of the triangular is to check. There's a U.S.-China relations is to check Soviet. But today, I think we use the terms of balance. For example, when China developed our relations to Russia, we want to make sure that reassure the United States that our bilateral relations is not target the third parties, the United States. The same case when Sino-Russia, China, the States' new model of the relations, it's not against Russia. So balance of the powers today is highest rule. I think the reason why Sino-Russian relations today is the best shape. First of all, I think because we have no any more border disputes or sovereignty disputes. This is very important. And secondly, we shared very similar worldview, the vision of the world, the vision of the international relations, is the same. And thirdly, I think both share of the same period of our rise over recovery of our economy. And another additional reason is that President Putin and President Xi, they have a very good personal relations.
All right, but one thing we need to mention here when it comes to U.S.-China relations, both of you and Professor Ross keep on mentioning about the very new era that we are facing and the new type of relations. We used to have a saying, so-called same bed, different dreams, and that has been such a political rhetoric spreading around the academic communities in China and also U.S. And now people are talking about different version. They say different beds and different dreams, meaning different visions about the world and different ways of achieving different visions about the world between Washington and Beijing. So what's going on here? Are we getting ever farther apart, Professor Yuan?
Yeah.
Professor Ross, I'm going to let you respond to that as well, but Professor Yuan first, briefly.
I think before my good friend Bob Ross' response, I will remind me of this very famous title of another American friend's David Lampton's book,
Right.
Same Bed, Different Dreams. I prefer using the different beds and the different dreams because actually we never in the same bed at all. Right after the Cold War, we we are totally in the different beds. And sometimes we have the same dreams, but many other times we have different dreams. Maybe sometimes we have same vision, but how to achieve the vision and the way to mean is different. For example, in dealing with the Korean crisis, nuclear crisis, China prefer to use dialogue, negotiation, comprehensive ways, but Americans sometimes prefer to use sanction and military ways.
Let me go to Professor Ross immediately. Yeah. Professor Ross, different beds, different dreams. How big are the beds and how different are they? DPRK issue, is that likely to be one issue that we can focus on to tell the realities?
First, I agree with Yuan Peng that this is not a Cold War, nor is it likely to become a Cold War. This is in two respects. One, we do have many differences on security issues in the South China Sea, but what's remarkable is that we can separate these issues out. So we cooperate on North Korea with UN sanctions, we cooperate on the environment, we still have good meetings and summits, and of course we trade a lot. Nothing like that of a mixed relationship existed during the Cold War, nor is that likely to develop in our relationship. Second, the triangular relationship is much less severe today. Of course, the Sino-Russian relationship is very cooperative, but we don't, from the American side, we do not see Russian cooperation and assistance to China as a major factor for American security in East Asia. Nor do we see Chinese assistance to Russia as a major factor in Europe. Whereas, of course, during the Cold War, we saw this Sino-Soviet alliance as contributing and partnering to cooperate against the United States. Very different era. Now, on the one hand, we both exist in Asia. We both exist in East Asia, and there's no getting away from that. But clearly, we have different expectations and different objectives. The United States is a status quo power. The Chinese naturally, as the expression goes, yosozoe. The Chinese want to accomplish things as their power has risen. And so that the status quo is difficult for them with the American domination of the South China Sea and the East China Sea and alliances around China's perimeter. And so our basic fundamental conflict is we have different objectives in East Asia, and this will be hard to manage.
And of course, Professor Ross, you know this better than I do, that there has been a lot of talk from both countries talking about agenda against one another because of the different visions and so-called different dreams. What do you think the realities are? And particularly when you have pivot to Asia, rebalance in Asia, you also have the presidential election going on, likely to be more rhetoric coming from the candidates. That's only natural, but on the other hand, it does harm the relations. And what to expect, Professor Ross?
Well, again, I agree with Yuan Peng. We have been in different beds since the end of the Cold War. As the two most significant countries in the world, the most capable countries in the world, operating in East Asia, a vital region for both of us, this is an intrinsically competitive relationship. I don't think we have an agenda of opposing each other, but indeed we do compete because we are concerned about each other's intentions and capabilities. Our election will get difficult. We have an experience with this, of course, in the past. But as we watch the election, China is not the most important issue. We're dealing with many issues in the United States, including the Middle East, including Syria, including immigration, including the economy. And so my hope is that the role of U.S. policy toward China remains a secondary issue in the U.S.-China relationship. Now, the United States also has a challenge. I mentioned earlier the Chinese government has a challenge in managing both its rise and stability in East Asia. The Americans have a challenge. We need to find a way to maintain our security and resist excessive Chinese demands. Well, we also need cooperation with China, very important for us. And I must say, this has been a challenge for U.S. foreign policy as well.
Right, well, it's been there for quite some time. Mr. Burbidge, given all the circumstances the other two guests from China and U.S. were talking about, what does it mean for Russia? What kind of chances and opportunities would those circumstances mean for Russia, the chemistry between China and Washington?
Well, I would say that if we look at this triangle, China, Russia, the United States, if you look closer at history, you will see that each of these countries wants the other two to compete with each other while this third country would try to enjoy good relations with the other two poles of this triangle. And if you look at history, the bad guy, you know, I would say the insanity moved from one country to another. Of course, the Soviet Union under Stalin and his successors was not a very predictable state. So this made the Sino-American alliance in the 1970s possible when Nixon came to Beijing, you know, a proverbial situation. Right now, unfortunately, the unpredictable pole, the dangerous pole, is the United States. Because even if you look at the symbolic things, why did Mr. Obama decide not to come to China for the parade to commemorate the end of the World War II? Why he didn't come to Russia for the same kind of parade? Russia and China lost more people than any other nations during the World War II. So symbolically, it was a very aggressive and I would say disrespectful attitude from Mr. Obama. So in this situation, when you have one of the poles behaving irrationally, the other two poles usually unite against it. And this is the long-term trend that I foresee in the future.
Okay, very interesting over there. You see, Professor Yuan, when it comes to discussion with China, US, and China-Russia, the focus is different. China-Russia, very specific cases, as our Russian guests talk about. China-US, very strategic views coming from both of you. So eventually, your judgment here, where is China? Where is this balance?
I think the Chinese way to manage those triangular relations is to becoming a bridge, because today I think the top three military powers and top three permanent members of the Security Council, we bound to work together. If those three countries working together, the world war is totally unimaginable. And the space cooperation also another example. I know that the US and Russia has very good space cooperation, so I hope in the future we can have a triangular cooperation.